In the remote desert country of west central Utah, a pair of steel rails provide an important connection between Salt Lake City and Southern California. Known today as Union Pacific's Lynndyl Subdivision, this 207-mile-long territory is the northern segment of the former San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake rail line. Although it is not one of Union Pacific's busiest corridors, the Lynndyl Sub does offer the patient railfan a variety of trains. Intermodal trains run to and from the ports at Long Beach. Coal trains enter off the Sharp Subdivision from Provo. Long manifest trains originate from various points such as North Platte, Nebraska, or West Colton, California. And an occasional rack train makes an appearance. In addition to through trains, locals are busy servicing the various industry along the line, powered by older EMD SD70Ms. We will begin at the crew change point in Milford and head north to Salt Lake City, passing old ghost towns such as Black Rock and Clear Lake. The old railroad town of Lynndyl marks the junction with UP's 88-mile Sharp Subdivision to Provo, which was the original route of the LA&SL. North of Lynndyl, trains enter what is known as the Lemington Cutoff toward a crossing of the Tintic Mountains at Boulter. The line then drops down through the Rush and Tooele valleys to the southern shore of the Great Salt Lake. At Smelter, Western Pacific's main line from Northern California joins the Lynndyl Sub, adding more traffic to the mix for the final miles to Salt Lake City. We will spend some time at Grant Tower and catch Utah Transit Authority's frontrunner commuter trains in action. And the Salt Lake City Southern makes an appearance as well. Shot both in winter and summer, the stark contrast between the seasons adds to this amazing presentation, which is our final chapter of the old Salt Lake route. Join us now for Union Pacific's Lynndyl Subdivision. The San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake route was mostly the idea of a Montana mining baron and U.S. Senator named William Andrews Clark. The railroad was incorporated in 1901 and completed in 1905, although much of the line that we'll be visiting today was already in place by 1880. The San Pedro name was dropped in 1916, since the town of San Pedro had been consolidated with Los Angeles by that time. And in 1921, Clark's half interest in the railroad was purchased by the UP. The LA&SL Corporation existed on paper until January 1st, 1988. Originally, the LA&SL was divided into 7 subdivisions between Los Angeles and Salt Lake City. We will be exploring what was the 6th sub between Milford and Lynndyl, and the 7th sub into Salt Lake City. Milford is milepost 576.7, and the division point with the Caliente subdivision, which heads south or railroad west toward Las Vegas. From here, the rail line heads north through a valley along the Beaver River, past the sidings of Murdock and Reed, before arriving at the ghost town of Black Rock. The grade then turns to the northeast, avoiding the Crooked Mountains which rise out of the Black Rock Desert. After passing the siding of Cruz, trains arrive at Bloom and the junction with the Graymont Western's Cricket Mountain Lime Plant, which is serviced by the UP. The railroad drops down into the Pavant Valley, past the siding and former railroad town of Clear Lake, then over a section of tangent track through Van before arriving at the next actual town north of Milford called Delta. From here, the line loosely follows the Sevier River through the siding of Strong before reaching the former division point of Lynndyl. The original main line headed northeast through Leamington and on to Salt Lake City by way of Provo. Union Pacific opted for an alternate route with gentler curves and an easier grade, and in 1903, the Leamington cutoff was completed. It shaved 16 miles off the old line and had a ruling grade of only 0.8%, making it ideal for heavier trains. Today, the old Provo line is UP's Sharp Sub, and it is the preferred route for coal trains coming off the old DNRGW line over Soldier Summit. The Lynndyl Sub continues north to Champlin, then starts up a 0.8% grade through the Tintic Mountains, passing Jecicho, McIntyre, and Tintic before arriving at the summit just west of the siding at Boulter. At this point, trains begin a 0.8% downhill run through Lofgreen, Fearson, and Faust before entering the Rush Valley near St. John. After passing Stockton and Warner, the railroad skirts the western flank of the Ochre Mountains as trains continue downgrade to the south shore of the Great Salt Lake at Lake Point. Just to the east is the junction with the former Western Pacific Main Line at Smelter, milepost 766.4. The Lynndyl Sub continues east into Salt Lake City, passing Grant Tower, and on to our concluding point at UP's North Yard. We have lots to show you, so let's get started now. Our journey begins on a cool winter's evening in Milford, Utah, a quiet little railroad town first settled in 1873. Well, mostly quiet anyway. If one were to describe this town's ambient tone, it would be that of slumbering road engines near the depot, their hypnotic drone occasionally interrupted by a passing train en route between Salt Lake City and Los Angeles. On this night, one such train approaches, announced by its headlight as it slowly makes its way to the depot for a crew change. Closer to us in the yard, a crew of a local prepares to do some switching, and the conductor takes a derail down for the UP 7414 and 6745. As the pair of GEs pass out of frame, UP 8668 West begins the next leg of its journey over the Lynndyl Subdivision for a nighttime run to Las Vegas. The remote town of Milford is an away terminal for crews out of Las Vegas or Salt Lake City, as well as a home terminal for local crews. The town's motel and the all-night Penny's Diner are the only game in town. The diner contracts with the railroad to provide hot meals for crews, as well as a shuttle service to and from the depot. It was cattle ranching and mining that first brought settlers to Milford in 1873. The Utah Southern Railroad, incorporated by Mormon businessmen and later purchased by the UP, arrived in 1880 to tap the rich silver and lead mines in nearby Frisco. It was served by a branch line that existed until 1943. The rest of the LA&SL main line to the south through Las Vegas and on to California wasn't completed until 1905. Some early residents described Milford as a perfect mud hole, or the perfection of desolation. It was incorporated in 1903, and at that time boasted a population of around 280 people. Today, Milford's population is in the neighborhood of 1,400. Located in the Escalante Desert between the Mineral Mountains and the Star Range, Milford has that charm of a small western town with a main street which still faces the reason for its existence, the railroad. The classic Hotel Milford was built in 1913 and has been in a state of renovation for many years. If you walk down the main street a few blocks north of the hotel, you will find this small city park with a cupola caboose number 25729, built in August of 1975. It was retired in May of 1989 and donated to the city in September of that year. The current yard office building replaced an immaculate Spanish Mission-style depot, which the railroad demolished in 1980. It was similar to what you can still find along the old LA&SL main line in Kelso, California, at the bottom of Cima Hill, and Caliente, north of Rainbow Canyon. Just east of the yard is the Smithfield Feed Mill, whose grain elevators are one of the local landmarks. A nearby loop track can accommodate grain trains, and an EMD SW1200 number 1200 is parked nearby. Milford sits at an elevation of 4,967 feet, near the geographic center of Beaver County, Utah. This aerial view is looking west. The distant San Francisco Mountains make up the background. The largest, Frisco Peak, rises to over 9,600 feet at its summit. Looking south of the yard, the Lynndyl Subdivision angles off to the right toward the Nevada state line, on what was once LA&SL's third subdivision. Back at ground level, a local gets ready to do some flat switching. Behind the train, westbound double stacks pause momentarily for a crew change. Car kicking, also known as flat switching, is one of the most common switch moves on the railroad. The engines shove the cars to get them rolling at the proper speed, and the cut is made. The trick is pulling the pin when the slack is in, otherwise the uncoupling mechanism will not operate. After each cut, switches are lined to the desired track for the next cut. With a fresh crew on board, UP 2757 heads west for Las Vegas. Satellite antennas gaze skyward near geothermal plant road, while an older form of communication stands derelict along the right-of-way, placed 40 poles to the mile. A high-priority intermodal train led by a rebuilt GE AC 4400 CW number 5867 heads for Milford for a crew change. After the westbound clears, we see a yellow overflashing red, indicating the dispatcher has something lined into the industrial track at Murdock. That something is a lone GE number 6557. Running long hood forward without ditch lights, the engine is restricted to 20 miles per hour over grade crossings. After a 30-minute wait, the 6557 returns west with a string of ballast cars. On a blustery January afternoon, a westbound monster manifest led by UP 6337 passes the same crossing. The train is running with distributed power in a 2x2x1 configuration. On a warm summer evening at twilight, we find a wind farm just east of the main line. While their red beacons flash in unison, a high green shines brightly from control point CPC 591 near the east switch of Reed. It calls a westbound, which is just cresting a small rise near Black Rock. The maximum grade for westbounds here is a meager 0.35%. As trains approach milepost 599, they pass the siding and ghost town of Black Rock. This was once a station stop on the LA&SL, located about 20 miles north or railroad east of Milford. The small community center, nestled in the Beaver River bottoms of southern Millard County, had an operating post office from 1891 to 1959. Roads were scarce in this lonely desert country, making the railroad the only reliable mode of transportation outside of a good horse. However, as more roads were built and others improved in the early 20th century, Black Rock's importance diminished and eventually faded. On the UP timetable, Black Rock is a 6,022-foot siding. A bit short by today's standards, but it still finds use now and then. A green signal at the east switch beckons UP 5590 east, while a summer storm blows through. A Norfolk Southern GE number 9961 assists this train to Salt Lake City. Black Rock gets its name from the obsidian-covered hills that rise above the Beaver River east of the Cricket Mountains. The latter can be seen in the distance, rising out of the Great Basin Desert to heights of over 6,000 feet. This is a land of contrasts. In the summer, it's not uncommon for daytime temperatures to top 100 degrees, while winters can be cold and snowy. For this reason, we planned 2 trips to the Lynndyl Subdivision, one in January, the other in July. During our January trip, we see that UP has some use for the 6,000-foot siding as a temporary home for these old hoppers. They are most likely waiting to be loaded at the Graymont lime plant east of here at Bloom. Another green is spotted at the east switch. this time for UP 7452 with empty coal hoppers. The following morning, a green shows on the main at the west switch for westbound stacks, this time led by UP 6174. The train races toward Milford, leaving an icy wind in its wake. That won't be the case on this day. The temperature is just shy of 100 degrees as the afternoon clouds provide a momentary reprieve from the intense sun. The railroad continues in a north-northeast heading through an arid volcanic field known as the Black Rock Desert. Covering more than 700 square miles in eastern Millard County, it is the site of multiple volcanic cones, craters, lava tubes, pressure ridges, and hot springs. It is anything but flat. Trains rise and fall with the land much like ships at sea, only these swells don't move. UP 6344 takes a manifest west toward Black Rock. The train curves toward the siding of Black Rock, and we move from our vantage point toward the crossing. UP's 50 local out of Milford has been waiting in the hole for the 6344 to pass, and now has green lights to Bloom, where it will service a lime plant. Slipping back into the icebox of January, the tops of the Cricket Mountains are shrouded in a freezing fog, while we set up at Cruz for our next westbound. UP 8213 is in charge of the morning Z out of Salt Lake City. Z trains are the highest priority on the railroad. They are usually identified by having plenty of locomotive power to maintain a maximum track speed and often have timely UPS trailers somewhere in the consist. UP 4587 takes the local east through Cruz. The local is on its way to switch the Graymont lime plant, located near the Cricket Mountains to the west of the main line at Bloom. This is one of the largest lime plants in the western United States. Limestone and dolomite are mined in the mountains around 6 miles to the west. The limestone is crushed at a quarry and delivered by truck to this plant, where 5 coal-fired kilns process the material into a variety of lime products used in both the U.S. and Canadian markets. This facility was first opened in 1980 by Continental Lime. At that time, it operated a single kiln that produced 500 tons of lime per day. The plant grew to 3 kilns by the early 1990s, and today, under the ownership of Graymont Western, it can produce an estimated 2,500 tons per day. Served by the UP, this facility features a balloon loading track and several storage tracks for rail cars. Our eastbound local has entered the industrial spur at Bloom and now backs a cut of cars onto the balloon track at the northeast side of the facility. After completing its work, the 50 local pulls back onto the main at Bloom, crossing State Highway 257. Rail fanning on the Lynndyl Subdivision can require a good deal of patience, as trains are often separated by long blocks of time. During daylight hours, we saw anywhere between 2 and 6 trains, not including the daily track inspector. During the waiting hours, one has a chance to take in the vast desert surroundings, which seem to have changed little since the rails were first laid here in the 19th century. Just before dark, a headlight announces UP 9592 West, dragging a heavy manifest toward Milford for a crew change. A second column of smoke gives away its mid-train remote as it climbs a 0.6% grade out of Clear Lake. A couple of foxes dart across the tracks just ahead of the train. SD70Ace number 8706 is smoking a little as it leans into the middle of the train. In another hour, this westbound will make a nighttime crew change at Milford before continuing on its westbound journey. Bloom appears on the timetable as a 5,989-foot siding with control point CPC 618 marking its east switch. It is interesting to note that the line plant spur comes directly off the main east of the east switch and not out of the siding, which is actually on the other side of the main. Because of this, through trains occasionally have to wait if the local is busy switching the plant. There will be no waiting on this January evening as the local is tied down in the siding. From the Harriman Center in Omaha, Nebraska, the UP dispatcher has hung a green for an eastbound rail train led by UP 7778. Earlier in the day, we had caught the local working the plant while a light snow fell. The Graymont Western line plant's capacity is around 25 cars per day, making this a regular stop. Moving just east of Bloom, trains drop down through a small cut as they dip down toward Clear Lake. UP 5590 is eastbound. UP 6735 is tucked into the middle of this long manifest. This is mid-July, and summertime thunderstorms are spending their energy in the mountains of Utah, giving us some nice moody stormlight. We found the winter variety of stormlight too, as clouds heavy with snow and rain gather in the mountains to the east and north. Our destination is somewhere in that vast distance beyond the horizon. And there are times when there is no horizon, such as on this winter morning as a freezing fog settles in. The morning Z appears like a ghost behind UP 7183. Other times, the horizon is cloaked in a thick layer of smoke from wildfires burning in the mountains to the east. Against that smoky backdrop, a smoke of a different kind announces our next westbound. SD70 Ace number 8607 gives its best impersonation of Big Boy 4014 as it works between Clear Lake and Bloom. Actually, the Big Boy doesn't smoke that much. The UP steam crew usually runs a fairly clean stack. A much cleaner Gevo number 8159 takes care of the DPU chores, getting this westbound over the road. By the spring of 1880, the Utah Southern Extension had been spiked in place through the Black Rock Desert. A siding was constructed where a long-established wagon road that was once an Indian trail crossed the main line. That siding became the station where people from neighboring communities of Fillmore, Millard, Garrison, and Gandy could board the train for Salt Lake City, or Milford, or Frisco. Soon, the station became the town of Clear Lake. This is the former town site of Clear Lake, which in the year 1900 boasted a population of exactly 100 people. It is said that only 70 people actually resided in the town itself and the other 30 lived in the vicinity. But that would be the zenith of the community, and by 1937, December 31st to be exact, the town's post office closed forever. Nearly all the residents had already left the town by that time. Today, Clear Lake is remembered by this plaque. In the distance, a familiar landmark to residents of Clear Lake still stands: Pot Mountain. Of course, the railroad remains, but the depot and water tower are long gone. One interesting story recorded by some residents of the town is of a head-on collision between two freight trains that took place around 1917. It happened near this spot, about 200 yards south of where the train station stood. An eyewitness said a train from the north had just gone through the crossing when he saw another train coming from the south. He wondered why it had not taken the siding. The two trains came together with a tremendous crash, one engine ending up on top of the other. Fortunately, no one was seriously injured, as the crew of both trains had jumped free. The wreckage and the cleanup was quite a distraction for the people of Clear Lake. It was said school children would congregate near the wreck site after school and stay until dark, or until their parents rounded them up. More than 100 years have passed since that time as we stand near the crossing and spot the headlight of a train coming from the north. There is no opposing traffic on this winter evening, and a clear block at West Clear Lake beckons the train into the night. Between Clear Lake and Delta, the track runs straight through the wide open desert. Because of this, we can see the headlight of a second westbound several miles behind this train. The manifest rounds the curve at Clear Lake, chasing green signals toward Bloom, while the headlight behind it materializes into an autorack train led by UP 8668. On our summertime visit, UP 9592 takes a westbound manifest through Clear Lake. As the train rounds the familiar curve, we pause one more time at the Old Town site as another day of rail fanning draws to a close. Railroad surveyors for the Utah Southern found that the shortest distance between 2 points was the Pavant Valley. It's nearly 20 miles from Clear Lake to the next town of Delta, both as the crow flies and the train rolls. This section of tangent track is the lowest point on the Lynndyl Subdivision, at least until the railroad reaches the Great Salt Lake at Lake Point. A local landmark in this empty land is Sunstone Knoll, a small peak north of Clear Lake that provides a great view of our surroundings. Many people come here to hunt for sunstones, a crystal that can be found in various parts of the world. We didn't see any, but then again we were too busy looking trackside as UP 6967 leads a westbound manifest between Van and Clear Lake. As we mentioned earlier, when a train is servicing the Cricket Mountain lime plant, the industrial spur is right off the main line and not in the siding. Right now, this morning's local out of Milford is working at Bloom, so this westbound will have to wait until it is in the clear and the switch has been lined for the main. After a 20-minute wait, UP 6967 is cut loose, and we watch the train as it is swallowed up by the immenseness of the desert. Just south of Delta are the old ruins of Fort Deseret. Built in 1865 to protect settlers from the Ute Indians during the Black Hawk War, this 550-square-foot fort had 10-foot walls made of mud and straw called adobe. It was built in just 18 days with a crew of 98 men. They used oxen to mix the mud and straw with their feet. The fact that it is still standing nearly 160 years later is a real testament to the builders of Fort Deseret and Utah's climate. The fort was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1970. The Lynndyl Subdivision passes within 1,800 feet of the old adobe fort between the siding of Van and Delta. Although out of sequence, UP 9592 is again seen on its westbound run. The train passes Pavant Butte, which rises over 700 feet above the valley floor. The old volcano is also known as Sugarloaf Mountain by locals. Delta is milepost 649.6 on the Lynndyl Subdivision. It began life as a railroad siding called Aiken. The name was changed in 1905 to Melville, but since Utah had another town named Millville, Melville was changed 3 years later to something that didn't sound anything like Millville. That was Burtner. No doubt this was confusing for residents of this town located on the delta of the Sevier River. So in 1911, Delta it was, and Delta it is to this very day. UP's 50 local switches industry at Delta on its way back to Milford. During the summer monsoon season, afternoon thunderstorms are the norm. While waiting at Delta for a westbound, our weather app showed a strong storm to the west heading our way, bringing heavy rain and gusty winds. While townspeople battened down the hatches, the UP dispatcher called our westbound, which was 15 miles away at Lynndyl, with a high wind warning. They were required to proceed at restricted speed until past the storm. This meant we would have a longer wait than expected. We were hoping the train would arrive before the storm, but that wasn't to be. Finally, UP 2669 West rolls through Delta slowly. Between Delta and Lynndyl, the railroad loosely follows the Sevier River as it meanders on its 400-mile course from its headwaters near Bryce Canyon National Park. It is the longest river entirely within the state of Utah. The name Sevier is derived from the Spanish Rio Severo, meaning violent river. Actually, it is a blessing for farms and ranches that rely on irrigation provided by the river as they work to feed the nation and the world. The coal-fired Intermountain Power Plant comes into view as we set up near the siding of Strong. It was once serviced by the Utah Railway and today by the UP. The plant is scheduled to be converted to natural gas by 2025. A westbound coal train has just come off the Sharp Subdivision out of Provo and heads west toward Delta behind UP 6177. A former Southern Pacific AC 4400 patched UP 6236 shoves on the rear of the heavy coal drag. There aren't many of these old SP painted motors left on the UP roster, and the old GE was a real treat. We have arrived at the namesake for the Lynndyl Subdivision. It is just a fork in the railroad where trains can be routed either north to Salt Lake City or northeast to Provo. The mains begin to separate at the devilish milepost of 666, the mark of the junction, and the control point for Lynndyl. An aerial view shows the Delta Egg Farm feed mill, which is serviced by the 50 local from Milford, as well as the 57 local out of Provo. In the steam days, a roundhouse and turntable once existed in the grassy area between the feed mill and the main line. Traces of the old facility are barely visible in the foreground of this shot. Lynndyl was originally named Leamington Hill Spur as the original main line from Salt Lake City was built here from Provo and through the neighboring community of Leamington. That route today is UP's Sharp Subdivision. The Lynndyl Sub continues north on what was originally called the Leamington Cutoff, completed by the UP in 1903. It is 16 miles shorter than the original route and runs west of the Tintic and Ochre Mountains to the southern shore of the Great Salt Lake. The Morning Z, led by UP 8153, comes off the old Leamington Cutoff and heads south, or Railroad West for Los Angeles, just after sunrise. Later in the morning, UP's 57 local out of Provo switches the Delta feed mill at Lynndyl with 3 SD70Ms for power. The 50 local was here earlier in the morning, and we saw it working at Delta. With its work complete, the LUL 57 returns east toward Provo on the 88-mile Sharp Sub. With the local out of the way, let's continue our journey over the Leamington Cutoff, following the code lines north. At Champlin, the railroad passes the Little Sahara Sand Dunes. Covering an area of 124 square miles, this is one of the largest dune fields in Utah. Sculpted by wind and time, and left over from ancient Lake Bonneville, the free-moving sand dunes are said to be heading north and east at a rate of 5 to 9 feet per year. More hoppers are spotted at the 6,797-foot siding. They partially block our view of the morning Z as it heads for Lynndyl behind UP 8449. The railroad passes another ghost town near milepost 686 named Jecicho. Located in the southern part of the Tintic Valley, the name comes from its desolate and sandy surroundings. Jecicho was originally a sheep shearing corral along the LA&SL. Later it was used as a camp for the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Great Depression. A few old barns and sheds stand empty above the main line, and the familiar concrete base of an old water tank tell us of the ghost town's importance during the steam era. Today, Jecicho appears on the UP timetable as a 9,709-foot siding with an additional house track most likely used by maintenance of way. Back at Chapman, Eastbound trains begin a 0.8% climb to the summit of the Tintic Mountains at Boulter. One such eastbound, a 10,000-foot manifest train led by UP 8706, approaches in the distance. A couple of DPUs shove on the rear of the train, including a big C6044AC number 7019, built in 1995, and newly rebuilt C44ACM number 9592, built originally in 1994 for the Southern Pacific as a -9 44CW. It is now upgraded with AC traction motors as preferred by the UP. A string of stack wells are currently stored in the siding of McIntyre near milepost 692. In the distance, a grain elevator marks the railroad grade east of the next siding of Tintic. In the vast high country beyond this is the summit of the grade between the west and east Tintic Mountains. Moving into the higher country above the 5,500-foot level, juniper trees are added to the trackside vegetation along with the ever-present sagebrush and telegraph poles. Back in January, the Tintic Mountains had a fresh dusting of snow, and a different set of bare tables occupy the 6,036-foot siding. What would turn out to be the only train we would see on this day climbs the 0.8% grade through McIntyre behind UP 9087. This stack train is most likely out of Long Beach, California. It gets a little extra help from UP 6515, cut in 3/4 of the way back. The last siding on the west side of Summit is called Tintic. Its distinguishing feature is this small water tank propped on the platform for a full-size tank. This was once a junction where branch lines served several mines in the East Tintic Mountains, including Eureka, Mammoth, and the Northern Spy Mine. The Tintic Mining District was home to some of the richest silver mines in the West. Before the railroads came, early mines were forced to ship ore by wagon, 60 miles over the mountains to the Great Salt Lake, then another 70 miles by boat to the North Shore to meet the Transcontinental Railroad there. In the early morning before sunrise, a westbound rack train led by a lone GE glides down grade through Tintic. Trains crest the summit near milepost 704 and start down a 0.8% descending grade at Boulter. A series of snow fences guard the tracks to the top of the pass, reminding us somewhat of Sherman Hill in Wyoming. The main difference is that the rock here is not pink like in the Laramie Mountains. UP 8706 drags its 10,000-foot manifest over the crest of the grade and starts down the north side on its eastbound run to Salt Lake City. The engineer throttles back as the train approaches. The DPUs transition from throttle to dynamics as they help ease the train downhill to the Great Salt Lake. Utah's dramatic Wasatch Mountains reach toward the winter sky as we set up at Lofgreen for our next train. The siding is 6,717 feet in length, with a west switch at control point CPC 711, just 73 miles from our destination of Salt Lake City. As we mentioned earlier, you often have to wait for some time in between trains. This is one such day. The 15th day of January, 2024. Little did we know we wouldn't see these signals go hot until the 18th of July. Well, okay, we didn't wait here 6 months, but when we did return, we had just enough time to get set up for the morning Z out of Salt Lake. Eastbound trains continue downgrade through Fearson and arrive at the 8,800-foot siding of Faust, near milepost 722. Again, the grade is only 0.8%, but that was enough to stall this heavy westbound manifest when one of its engines quit loading. The train would sit here for several hours, waiting for an additional engine to get over the road. It turned out the spare unit would be added to an eastbound, which would eventually arrive at Milford. In other words, this train wouldn't turn a wheel until after dark. Faust was originally a settlement founded by a Mormon immigrant from Germany named Henry J. Faust. In 1860, he managed a Pony Express station since this was on the trail they used. Later, this was used as a site to house railroad workers for the UP. An eastbound manifest led by UP 6547 glides down through a high-speed curve as it drops down grade at Faust. The railroad drops into the Rush Valley and past the Tooele Army Depot. The facility serves as a storage site for war reserve and training ammunition. It was first opened in 1942. More summertime thunderstorms brew overhead, and UP train crews have been issued flash flood warnings near the siding of Lofgreen to the west. While a track inspector holds the siding, UP 5414 leads another westbound monster manifest upgrade in the shadow of the storm. Fortunately, all units are working, and the train trudges ahead. Take a look at these vintage hoppers still painted for the Rock Island. Our guess is that they will be set out at Milford for the Graymont line plant at Bloom. The Lynndyl Subdivision continues down into the bottom of the Rush Valley, past the siding of St. John, near milepost 736. Irrigated farmland lines the track south of the community of Stockton, while afternoon thunderstorms provide irrigation of their own in the mountains. The temperature is 97 degrees Fahrenheit as we again catch the UP 5414 West. It slowly climbs a long grade away from the Great Salt Lake to the summit at Boulter. The railroad continues its course to the north-northeast through Stockton and Warrener along the western flank of the Ochre Mountains. From our vantage point near Erda, we can see the town of Tooele to the east. And to the west, we get our first view of the Great Salt Lake. A grain train heads west for Nevada and California on the former Western Pacific Main Line. Today, it is UP's Sharp Sub, which ties into the LA&SL just east of here at Smelter. Behind the train rises the bulk of Stansbury Island, the second largest within the Great Salt Lake. And in the foreground, Interstate 80 parallels the railroad between Salt Lake City and the Nevada state line. Looking west, the headlight of an eastbound appears near Grantsville. The Morton Salt Company has a facility there, and large mounds of salt can be seen behind the train. After the intermodal train disappears from view, we finally get some action on the Lynndyl Sub, as UP 2621 takes an interesting manifest train up the hill. It is running one by one by one. After the first 37 cars, UP 5826 ushers in the second section of the train, made up entirely of auto racks. GEVO number 8229 shoves on the rear of this westbound. Another rebuilt AC 4400 CW number 5967 takes an eastbound manifest toward Lake Point. Welcome to the Great Salt Lake, the largest saltwater lake in the Western Hemisphere. Fed by three major tributaries, the Weber, Jordan, and the Bear, the lake has no outlet except for evaporation, giving it a high concentrate of salt, much more so than the world's oceans. Early explorers thought this was an inland extension of the Pacific Ocean, and stories from early settlers as well as Indians mentioned a terrible monster with an enormous head that inhabited the lake. Enormous in number are the brine flies that populate the shore. They are apparently good eats for seagulls. The Saltair 3 Pavilion is a local landmark, built in 1981 out of an old aircraft hangar salvaged from nearby Hill Air Force Base. The first two Saltair pavilions were destroyed by fire, the oldest built in 1893. This one suffered a flood right after it was opened and now finds itself a growing distance from shore as the lake water recedes. The biggest landmark in the area, literally, is the 1,215-foot Garfield Smelter stack, located near the junction between the LA&SL and the Western Pacific Main Lines. This stack is the 60th tallest freestanding structure in the world, the 4th tallest chimney, and the tallest man-made structure west of the Mississippi. It was completed in 1974, replacing several smaller stacks. The smelter is owned by Kennecott Utah Copper, a division of the Rio Tinto Group. Kennecott operates the massive Bingham Canyon mine. It is 3/4 of a mile deep, 2.5 miles wide, and has been in production since 1906. Located to the south of the smelter in the Ochre Mountains, it has the distinction of being the largest man-made excavation and the deepest open-pit mine in the world. It is said that the Bingham County mine has produced more copper than any other mine in history. Kennecott Utah Copper once operated a vast rail line between the mine and the Garfield smelter, but it was eventually replaced by a series of conveyor belts stretching 17 miles in all. Today, rail operations are limited to the smelter, and we catch a couple of light engines returning from setting out cars for interchange with the UP at Garfield. The morning sun chins itself on the distant mountains as we set up at Smelter, control point CPC 766 on the Lynndyl Sub. which happens to be the nearest track. The far track is the former Western Pacific line to San Francisco, and this is where the two lines come together. This is where westbound train crews set their watches for Pacific time and turn their radios to AAR Channel 24. Note the mention of Amtrak's Desert Wind on the sign. That train saw its last service here on May 10, 1997. UP 2620 leads an eastbound empty coal train off the former WP and on to the Lynndyl Subdivision at Smelter. It looks like the rear DPU has picked up a smoking habit. An old AC 4400 CW number 6071 has a little flame up the stack as it shoves on the rear drawbar. Later in the afternoon, UP 2669 leads an eastbound manifest through Smelter beneath the large stack as it races toward Salt Lake City. As we pan northward, the mountain above the train is a growing tailings pile from the copper mine. Enjoying some relief from the hot summer day, we pause for a pleasant sunset along the lake. Around 208 miles after leaving Milford, we arrive at Salt Lake City. Setting up at Grant Tower, our attention is turned from the tracks to the smoke in the mountains directly above the state capitol. With a cautious eye on the growing blaze, we catch a few trains here. Grant Tower was formerly an interchange between UP's LA&SL, Oregon Short Line, the Western Pacific, and the Denver and Rio Grande Western. Today it still is a junction, but now those roads are all UP. Well, that's not entirely true. Utah Transit Authority commuter trains pass through here on their own rails, as does the Salt Lake City Southern, a subsidiary of the Class 3 regional Utah Railway. An SL crew back a cut of tank cars through the junction with a pair of GP38-3s for power. Utah Transit Authority's front runner trains are a common sight as their tracks parallel the UP. This train is southbound as it pauses momentarily at the crossing of 600 West. We have been keeping an eye on that wildfire which apparently started just before we arrived. Although we never heard the cause, the temperature was near 100 degrees and the fire quickly grew to over 200 acres. A helicopter was the first air support on the scene and 100 firefighters were reported to have been sent to battle the blaze. Nearby residents were evacuated and the state capitol was set up as a temporary shelter. While the flames reach higher, our Salt Lake City Southern train is heard returning to the UP's North Yard. Another front-runner commuter train heads north. The next morning, the mountain looks quiet, although crews continue to mop up the previous day's fire. The good news is that no homes were lost and no injuries were reported. Here's to a quiet day in Salt Lake City. Except for the trains, of course. UP 7415 heads west out of UP's North Yard. The rear of the train ducks under Interstate 15 as it continues west. Just past Grant Tower, the Lynndyl Subdivision ends at the control point of CPC 784, also known as Salt Lake City. The Utah Transit Authority's Warm Springs Frontrunner facility is adjacent to UP's North Yard, and their main lines skirt the east side. Looking at the UP, there is quite a collection of SD70Ms in mothballs, taking up 4 of the 24 tracks of the yard. Our final train of the day, UP 5937, slowly exits the yard and ducks under the 600 North Street overpass as it begins its westbound journey over the Lynndyl Subdivision. This train may continue west for Northern California via the Western Pacific's line across Nevada and through the Feather River Canyon, or possibly over Donner Pass on the former SP. Then again, it may just continue towards Southern California using the 780-mile route of the old San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake. We hope you've enjoyed this look at a seldom visited rail line that follows a lonely path through the mountains, canyons, and deserts of Utah, Nevada, and California. As always, until next time, thanks for watching.